Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. The regular meeting of the Grosse Ile Township Planning Commission will come to order. Before we all rise to the Pledge of Allegiance, I would just like to say a few words about a very valued member of our Planning Commission for many, many years, Ann Jaworowski, who at the age of 99 years passed away last week. Ann Jaworowski was a fine lady. She sat over here on my left for about the last 15 years. And I remember distinctly when I first came on the commission and was elected to chair, I really didn't know what I was doing. And Ann called me to her house, and she mentored me. And she told me what I needed to do in order to succeed as a chairman. And she taught me. And there's nothing more valuable than that as far as I'm concerned. Really a fine lady. And she had a good long life at 99 years, and we're sure she's in a much better place now. So after the Pledge of Allegiance, I would ask everybody just to stay on your feet, please, and we're going to have a minute of silence in her memory. So on that note, if we could all stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible. Very much. I'm sure Ann will continue to be here in spirit with us. I'm sure those of you who might be watching on television, you'll see a new face down at the far end of the table. We have a new board liaison, Udo O'Connor, who I'm very happy is here. Udo, would you care to say a few words about the planning and
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've been interested in planning since I was first appointed to be clerk, and Lorinda and I worked together on our credentials as citizen planners and as master citizen planners. Unfortunately, you have a lot of continuing education credits that you then don't follow up on after you leave office for a while. So those have expired, but it was just always very interesting to me to learn, what planning decisions were based on. I served on the zoning board for quite a few years and found that to be very interesting. And so I was just very happy. Thank you for inviting me to be your liaison. I will do my best to carry information back and forth and hope to be of service to the community in this new capacity. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Uda, and welcome. And next to her is Eric Ranker, who was our former liaison, who I'm very glad decided he wanted to come back on the Planning Commission as a commission member. Years and years of Planning Commission experience, and we're certainly going to benefit by having your continued participation. Thank you, Eric.
Thanks, John. Glad to be here.
Okay, let's move to additions or deletions to the agenda. Anybody want to change the agenda from that presented? Hearing none, I'll entertain a motion to approve the agenda as submitted. Motion from Jim, support?
Support.
Support from?
Brian.
Call the question, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Motion carried. The agenda stands as presented. We will now move to the minutes, which were in the package. These are the minutes from the October 17th meeting. Anybody have any comments on those minutes? Any comments on those minutes? Entertain a motion then to approve the minutes as submitted.
So moved.
Motion from Jim, support.
Support.
Support from
Eric.
Eric.
Support.
All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Motion carried. As usual, Lori, excellent job. You keep us right on track. I know it's a tough job sometimes. The next item is public comment, an opportunity for people to talk with the commission about any item not on the agenda. Anybody want to talk about something not on the agenda? Seeing no hands, we'll move to the first discussion topic, which is electronic changeable message signs. A little background on this. Back in October, a citizen approached us asking that we reconsider our current ordinance position, which prohibits electronic signs on the island. The basic argument was that in the case of this particular individual, there was a church that she was associated with that wanted to communicate activities that were going on and was rather seriously constrained by the fact that we no longer had an EO camera. And could we consider electronic sign permit, which would allow, for example, churches to have these signs? At that point, the Planning Commission decided that we would have our subcommittee look at it, and that subcommittee met back in probably November, and we talked about the issue, talked about pros and cons and various elements of it, and Brian captured those thoughts, and we thought we would bring it back to the commission tonight to have a discussion about this to see what is the general consensus to what direction we feel we ought to go for the subcommittee. Because typically what would happen if we were to proceed with something, the Planning Commission would direct the subcommittee, basically Jay and Jim and me and Brian, to kind of work details to present back to the commission at a later point. But given the sorts of discussion that we had, we felt that we needed more direction. And so that's coming back tonight to everybody, and Brian will be summarizing that. After all that went down, and just before the December meeting, which was canceled, I got a call from a representative from the VFW, and I was asked about their participation in the meeting. Could they make comments? And I said, absolutely, come to the meeting. And, well, that really wasn't possible given schedule conflicts. So I said, well, in lieu of that, please write a letter. We'll present it to the commissioners, and I would read it at the meeting for everybody to hear. And he said that would be fine. So I'll read this note. This is from the VFW dated December 26, 2016, to the Planning Commission from VFW Post 7310. Dear Planning Commission members, as you recall, the Grocio VFW building was sold to an investor about 18 months ago as we felt we could no longer bear the cost to operate and maintain that facility. We now rent the facility and continue to conduct VFW meetings and services there as we have in the past. The one thing that has changed is our access to the sign in front of the building. The new owner uses that sign to attract renters for the facility when its schedule is open. That brings us to the purpose of this letter, our interest in seeing Grocio install an electronic scrolling sign to be located at Four Corners. We believe the void created by the cessation of the EO camera to be significant, and despite the introduction of the Gross EO Connect, we believe our ability to reach out and communicate our message to the community has diminished. We recently invested in printed signs that are not inexpensive and not adaptable to multiple uses. That said, we believe an attractive scrolling electronic sign strategically located would serve the community interests and enhance community on Grocio. We have had brief discussions about such a sign with the Sacred Heart Knights of Columbus, and they have expressed strong interest in having access to such a sign to further their activities. If we are encouraged by the Planning Commission's response to this letter, we would contact every nonprofit organization on the island to have a more complete expression of interest. We do not believe an electronic sign could be used by every Grocio entity because the sheer number of clubs and organizations would create a message nightmare. It is the position of the VSW that this sign would be limited to only nonprofit organizations on Grocio. We envision this sign being owned by the participating nonprofits that share in its purchase, but that the township would operate it in order to have it properly managed and controlled. The VFW would be willing to contribute toward the cost of the sign, and presumably so would many other island nonprofits. We respectfully suggest that this could easily become a valuable asset to the township in promoting Grocio as an excellent community in which to live. A possible location for maximum viewing might be at the northwest corner of Parkway and Meridian. Such a sign would greatly reduce the number of signs on the northeast corner. The VFW will be represented at the January 30th, 2017 Planning Commission meeting to address any questions you might have. Signed, Barry Van England, Post Commander Robert Pierce, Quartermaster, and Gary P. Latendress, Adjutant. So that's the communication that's come in from the public, and I'm sure we'll be hearing from them this evening. But before we do, Brian, I think it would be appropriate at this point for you to summarize the issues that the subcommittee discussed and some of the potential options.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I just put a couple of real brief slides together. Nothing overly exciting tonight, unfortunately. So no fun pictures or graphics, just a lot of text. But it was able to kind of help me get my notes in order with a little background, a little bit of some of the points from the subcommittee meeting in November, and then obviously some items, I guess, for the full commission to consider. I do want to maybe take one step back before I jump into this based on the letter that you just read.
Please.
And there's really, because that's the first I've seen or heard of that particular request. And there's really a couple of things at play. I want to make sure that we understand it as a commission and make sure that the members in the audience understand as well. That letter really brings up a couple of different items, not just the use of electronic changeable message signs, which was really the intent of the discussion here tonight. But subsequent to that would also be the erection of a sign at Four Corners. That ultimately would be a consideration of the township board on township property. That goes back many, 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 many years, many times, many occasions to the discussion of a community sign board potentially at that location. I'm staring at Jay.
Yeah, I remember.
Pam Frucci was, she was really the leader of that discussion. And I say that
I remember,
with all respect. I guess I want to make sure that because they are represented here tonight, the authors of that letter, I want to make sure they understand that's a whole, in my mind, that's almost a completely different conversation than really what we were asked to look into and discuss with the subcommittee. Is use of Four Corners is not something that we as a commission, as a subcommittee, as your planning consultants have been asked to look into at this point in time. So
that is correct. This is a totally different direction. The previous request was for essentially churches.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, and really
to have the ability out front, and that request was specific to limit it to the churches, give them the opportunity, and keep everything else basically closed.
Thank you.
This is a request. This is a request for a community sign at Four Corners.
Exactly. I just wanted to make sure that we kind of had that distinction, and the conversations can certainly occur. And I think the conversation I intended for us to have this evening will go a long ways towards assisting that secondary conversation about use of Four Corners. But again, that's kind of a separate topic that will probably have to be revisited at a different point in time. So I just wanted to make sure we were kind of clear on that one.
Correct.
Thank you. So I just kind of, again, put some notes together. I wanted to make sure that we were all starting from the same background point in terms of our current ordinances, the task that the subcommittee was directed with, what we did myself and the subcommittee, what we sort of reviewed, researched, the things that we looked at, and then some of the questions and the concerns or the ideas that we came up with to present to the commission as a whole. So just to go back to that starting point, currently electronic changeable message signs are prohibited by the zoning ordinance. I think we all knew that, but I want to make sure that that's clear. Based on the conversation at the October meeting, the request put forth by a resident that you investigate, evaluate, and review potentially altering that ordinance, the subcommittee was asked to look further into it. So my starting point was to look at other example ordinances. I did find looking at trying to keep it geographically relatively close to Grosse Ile. So I kept it to Wayne County communities, kind of, for the most part, downriver-ish areas. You can question the actual boundaries of downriver. Not downriver, but I don't want to do that tonight. So I did find there are a handful of communities that currently do allow electronic changeable message signs, and they vary in their degree of regulation. Some very basic, some quite complicated and very detailed. So this is just a brief list of the ones we looked at. Brownstown and Romulus happen to be other clients of mine, so I was familiar with those. But I also found that Trenton, Lincoln Park, and Riverview do also allow for them. I also checked Wyandotte because of proximity, and no offense to Wyandotte, but your online ordinance is really hard to navigate. So I wasn't able to actually find their regulations if they have any. So at this point, I don't know if they allow them and or regulate them if they do. So putting that aside, I think we had enough examples from local communities as well as ordinances that my firm has drafted so that we at least have an understanding of the types of regulations that we could apply. In terms of the current ordinance beyond just the prohibition, I wanted to outline sort of how your sign ordinance regulates signs by use and or districts. So section 16.6 C and D regulate signage for churches, schools, other institutional uses, as well as municipal uses. Section 16.7 regulates residential signs in residential districts, and 16.8 covers our commercial, industrial, and the Airport Commerce Park district. Basically, part of the conversation with the subcommittee was to look at where this might be appropriate and or allowable, and right off the top, we all agreed that residential signage in residential districts in ECM was clearly not something that we felt was appropriate. And by residential signage in residential districts, I'm referring to like subdivision entry signs, might be a regular neighborhood, might be a condo sub, might be a multiple family development, but a residential use in a residential district. We did not feel that this was an appropriate use of signage in those particular locations. So with that being said, we turned our focus really to the institutional uses, institutional/municipal, and then also extending that into a discussion of what that could mean for commercial sites, which primarily would be Macomb Street, where we would have the greatest impact, in our opinion. So to take the last part first, we did feel there's a bit of a concern about Macomb Street, and I probably should have done this in a different order, but some of the concerns that we discussed on Macomb Street, really we tied to the intent of that district. I pulled three phrases from the intent section of your ordinance, and we have terms and phrases like traditional, small town, intimate character, those types of things, pedestrian friendly, not leaning towards the auto-oriented. And in my opinion, and I believe the subcommittee's opinion, and don't let me speak for you three if I'm off base, but I think we felt as though allowing ECMs in the Macomb Street district was really a start to going against the intent of our current regulations, which try to promote more of a traditional environment and scale in terms of our site design, our building design, that type of character. So right off the bat, we did kind of identify that as a potential concern. Moving on to the institutional type uses, and by that I'm kind of lumping in churches, schools, municipal sites. One of the concerns is that, at least for the churches in particular, those are located within residential zoning districts. They are surrounded by residential land uses. So if we were to allow for that type of signage at those locations, we want to make sure that we have very strict regulations to help protect those residences from any harmful impact, primarily being really the brightness. You know, the light levels on these signs, if you've ever seen some on at night when it's really dark, and if they don't have their sensors set right, they can be really bright. And I would not want for one of these signs to be shining into somebody's living room window. And I think you all would agree to that as well. So that's a concern from that angle in terms of allowing it potentially at a different site. Another concern, and this is where I kind of got into some of the ordinances that I've written. We generally try to regulate brightness, frequency of change of message. I have some communities that are so strict that you can only change it once a day. I have others that say every 5 minutes or every minute or something. So the frequency of change is something we often try to regulate. The sizes, I have some communities that allow them as your ground sign, and you could do your full ground sign. So here, like a 32 or a 40 square foot sign, some communities would allow that entirety of that sign to be ECM. Some would allow a ratio of that sign to be ECM. So you'd have potentially like 50% of it would be static. Maybe it's masonry, maybe it's, plexiglass, and then the other 50% of it could be ECM. So there's a lot of different ways to regulate these. The concern on my end is tied to the brightness and the frequency change, as those are very difficult to enforce. And you can imagine the brightness, we can have the specs on the sign that can be reviewed at time of permit, but if those aren't followed and we have to go out in the field, potentially to try to measure the light intensity coming off of a sign, while it could be a simple task, to do it right and to be highly technical with it is a pretty big undertaking. And I don't believe the township has the equipment to do that. I have a light meter back at the office to measure foot candles. It's really intended for downlit, like in a parking lot, and you can get a real rough reading. To try to get something that's going sideways and not down can be really difficult to do. So that's one. And then the frequency of change. If it's after business hours and there's no local enforcement out on the roads, nobody's going to sit, well, even if they are out on the roads and it is during business hours, nobody's going to sit there and watch and sit there and see if this thing changes, 5 minutes instead of 10 minutes or a half hour instead of an hour. So we can write those things in as protections, but the reality of actually enforcing that can be quite difficult as well. So I wanted to share that, at least in my experience, as a bit of a concern. Another item that came of it, as I mentioned earlier, I'm lumping multiple uses into institutional. Institutional really isn't defined in your ordinance. So if we were going to allow this and insert it into that particular paragraph, as a subcommittee, we talked about the need for better definition to that. What exactly are we talking about? Are we just talking about churches and schools and municipal sites, or is there some other type of use that is intended by that sort of broad terminology? So that would be something else we would definitely want to do. And then sort of tying the two together, there's definitely a concern of potentially allowing it somewhere but then prohibiting it elsewhere. The subcommittee and we talked a lot about fairness and trying to balance, the wants and needs of certain property owners with those of other owners. And were we to go down a path of allowing it for schools, churches, municipal sites, but not allowing it, say, for Macomb Street, are we setting ourselves up potentially to be unfair to those businesses and those business owners? That can be, I think we use the technical phrase, I think we called it a slippery slope, is the direction that we went with it in our meeting. And certainly, I think that's a valid concern. The closing point is one that I've not yet followed up and gotten an answer on, but not only a question of fairness in terms of doing that, but want to make sure if we were to do that, want to make sure that the township attorney is of the opinion that it's lawful for us to basically isolate these different sets of uses, which is okay in zoning generally, but to say you can have the brand new fancy sign technology, but the rest of you can't. And we really want to make sure that we're protecting the township against anything that would potentially be harmful down the road. So the closing point is if there's going to be additional discussion and debate on this matter, I will follow up. Next time I'm at Township Hall for my office appointments, I'll follow up with the township manager and the township attorney to have that discussion. We have a couple other topics we need to get to as well, so I'll add that to the list. But I want to make sure he would be aware of it and make sure that he's on board with whatever direction this commission would want to go in.
Brian, thank you for the short summary. That does encompass the things that our subcommittee did discuss for certain. A couple of other points before we go to the audience. The first, the role of ZBA. As long as this is a prohibited use, what is the role of ZBA?
Well, it's as of right now, I mean, if we viewed it as a use, this would probably be a question we'd have to give more thought to, but off the cuff, if we view it as a use, then it would be a use variance. The township does not have the authority to hear use variances. However, if we view it as a type of sign, it could potentially be viewed as a dimensional variance that ZBA might have standing to consider a variance for. The one thing I actually referenced in here, potential for future variance requests, that tied in for me, that ties into the slippery slope idea. We allow one subset of uses or districts to have them, but not others. Do we then potentially see a number of ZBA cases saying, I want what they have, and you're not being fair to my use, my business, my district, which, again, I think we'd be in pretty good standing to not necessarily grant those variances, but it's a valid question. It certainly could occur. To date, our Zoning Board of Appeals has not seen a request for a variance from a sign type to allow an ECM where they're otherwise prohibited.
Okay, thank you. The second point is one that we all have to keep in mind when we're considering an ordinance change. Now, I remember the discussion that this commission had probably 5 or 6 or 7 years ago about wind turbines in neighborhoods, and when people were discussing this, they were thinking in terms of, one neighbor will have it in the neighborhood. Okay, well. And that's not bad, okay? But then when you think about it, the fact that every house on a given block has that same right and may choose to have, going down the street, not one house with a turbine, but 25 in a row, theoretically. What does that do to the neighborhood? And so you have to think about it in terms of what is the full potential of whatever this application is, to have an impact on the community. It will be exactly the same thing potentially with these signs, and it's something that we have to think about it, because it isn't by necessarily exception. It becomes a right.
Correct.
Which means everybody has that potential to use it, and we have to think about it. What is the community going to be like if a significant majority chose to go that direction? So it's one of the reasons why managing ordinances is not automatically so easy. You can have unintended consequences if we're not careful. So, at this point, before we take questions and discuss this further, let's hear from the audience and hear what people have to say. Would anybody like to address the commission? Come on up and give us your name and your address, and we'd like to hear your comment.
All right. Well, thank you. First of all, my name is Gary Latondras. I live at 9980 Hawthorne Glen Drive, and I am an officer of the VFW Post, among other things. And I'm here with the Post Commander, Barry Van Engelen, and the Post Quartermaster, the bookkeeper, Bob Pierce. And we appreciate you allowing us to come and make our pitch. And just as a little quick background, one of the human interest aspects of the letter and this request started with a wonderful old gentleman, a Navy veteran who I think he's been at the Post probably longer than the three of us combined. His name's Joe Berkey. Was on the USS Wasp when it was sunk during World War II, bobbed around in the Pacific Ocean. And after we got ourselves in this jam without the use of our sign, attendance at our Veterans Day, Memorial Day, Pearl Harbor Day declined significantly. And quite honestly, it upset him greatly. So after 2 or 3, when are you guys going to get a sign? You know, we need a sign. So that precipitated the three of us to tackle making a sign for Joe Berkey this past Veterans Day. And we learned some things. We understood that and applied and got the proper sticker to put our sign up. We put one up in front of the post, and we put one on, I guess it would be the northwest corner. And we were proud of our sign because it didn't topple over. It was neat. It was patriotic looking. And we didn't think it detracted from the appearance of Four Corners. Other signs, not so much. So I wish I would have thought of it. I would have put it in the letter that, neatness and the reduction in the number of signs at Four Corners would probably be considered an enhancement. That said, we are willing to pay for the sign. We're willing to help bring other nonprofit organizations or whatever the Planning Commission might deem appropriate. And I understand what you're saying. Giving the rights to nonprofits may make other groups unhappy. We understand that. But on the other hand, we're not selling anything. We're volunteers. We do community service at great lengths. We would love to get better attendance at other programs. We sponsor a Patriots Pen program at the high school, and we have participation in the middle school. We even have participation from a Groseal teacher who teaches in Woodhaven that makes it a point to have her class send letters on Veterans Day, and we read them at Veterans Day and Pearl Harbor Day and whenever, and we would like to invite their parents and to hear the best of the best, and it's just tough to communicate. The ill camera, the loss of it was huge. And I'm a techie. I've got iPads, iPhones, I got everything, but I don't think everybody does. And if you do have it, it doesn't necessarily get you the message. And quite honestly, Groseal Connect kind of confuses me. Some things seem to come through that I'd expect to come through, other things not so much. But at any rate, we're going to continue to have signs, but it seems to us, if you'll allow us, we like, our sign did the job. We had better attendance, and we would intend, if forced, to go print more signs and go out there and put heavy-duty stakes in so that they don't blow over and look unsightly. But on the other hand, it's an electronic age. Why not? If it's done professionally, if it's done correctly, by your rules, we're not asking to run it. We wouldn't want to run it. We'd want you to decide what the ground rules for it are. But I can see the potential to help the Rotary Club, the Kiwanis Club, the Goodfellows, every nonprofit organization trying to do good in the world and on Grosse Ile would probably love to get their message out in a very modern day way, attractive way, and that's why we're here. So if you have any questions, I think the three of us would be more than happy to try and answer them.
Okay, just one comment. I want to make sure you understand the point that Brian was making earlier. Okay, we're discussing this from the standpoint of basically across the island. Okay,
Understood.
Down to for individual property owners. The township, okay, the township board of trustees would be the ones who would address specifically a question of a sign at Four Corners, not this commission. This commission would only enable that by changing the ordinance to allow it, and then it would be a board of trustees consideration as to whether to build that sign or allow that sign as part of their overall authority on the township.
Well, that doesn't...
Udo, would you comment on that, please?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, as the liaison, I've already made a note to take your message back to the township board. Essentially, in order to do an ECM sign at Four Corners, as the chair mentioned, two things would have to happen. One, the ordinance would have to allow an ECM sign to be built. And then the next step would be to take it to the township board. And that's been done before, and unfortunately, however you look at it, it's been shot down in the past. But you could also argue that circumstances have changed considerably in the past couple of years with the demise of the EO camera, that there is now a stronger need for this kind of communication signage. One overriding problem that the township board has always bumped into is it also needs to work with Wayne County in order to place a sign near a roadway. And so they've created let's say, a framework that you have to get around so that it doesn't become an obstruction, a distraction, and I think they have a number of rules and regulations that such a sign would have to work with. That said, I think it would be very important to bring your, pardon the pun, message to the township board and make that same proposal. So on the one hand, the Planning Commission can entertain and propose a change of the ordinance to allow these electronic changing message signs, ECM signs. And only after that would that kind of a sign be potentially allowed anywhere on township property. So you've got two different hurdles to overcome. I don't want to be a naysayer because I've often appreciated Mrs. Frucci's efforts, and she went as far as finding donors to actually pay for signage, many different presentation sorts. There's one at the post office where people can place flyers. I know that goes back to Mrs. Frucci. But in the end, it's always come down to Wayne County having a problem with us citing a sign close to a roadway. And that's always been an objection that we've not been able to overcome. But we can think creatively. And so bring this to the township board and when the time comes, we'll see if we can make that happen.
I understand that, and I appreciate that. I guess we got here because I guess the township supervisor alerted us that there was a prohibition against these signs, and he suggested we start here. So we did, fully expecting, since it would be on township property, that that would be a logical next step, and that doesn't concern us. We have more paper. And but as far as Wayne County, I'd say, I get around, that's a pretty impressive big sign that the city of Wyandotte has in the middle of 4th Street. And if there was ever something that would be a distraction, I think that would be it. And I think a well-designed, managed electronic sign that handled, what would you say, 15, 20 nonprofits, probably? I have no idea how many there are, but we'd educate ourselves and track them down. I'd think it'd look a lot better for the township than having ragtag signs at times on every corner. I think you'd consolidate them. That wouldn't prohibit those signs from going there. That's why we propose the other side of the street. Because we know by our proposal, we're not all inclusive. I understand that too, but we are nonprofit, and we are willing to pay for it. And we'd happily tell that to whoever wants to listen. So if you can give us any advice on the best way to approach the township board, we'll get on with it.
Well, I would say the first thing is to deal with step one, which is to listen to the discussion that comes from the table tonight.
Sure.
In terms of what this commission would recommend to the township board. We are not the final decision maker for ordinances. The township board makes the final decision. We make the recommendation.
Fair enough.
And so, again, it would not be specifically for a sign at four corners. It would be allowing electronic signs under some circumstance, for some or all, depending on the variables that Brian mentioned, or not at all.
Fair enough.
So that's where we are.
Okay.
But I definitely sympathize with you. I'm a veteran too, and I appreciate the same sort of things that you're doing. It's a shame that your landlord wouldn't enable you to at least use that sign for key events like what the things you're talking about. That seems.
One would think.
That seems pretty
heavy-handed.
Distressing.
It is.
Okay. Yes.
If I could just add, though, you did the right thing by coming here first. Every movement needs to reach critical mass before something happens. And showing us that there is a desire and a demand for this kind of signage in that particular location or island-wide, that's where that has to start. And so now, this commission can also say, it's not just an individual, it's not just a church, but that there's more behind this desire than just a few individuals. So that was a really good thing that you did by coming here and raising the issue.
Got to be lucky once in a while.
Thank you. Yeah. Any other things for us right now?
No.
Okay, we'll go to the next speaker. Bob, your name and address, please, as if everybody doesn't know.
Bob Pierce, 18400 Cardinal Drive. The first thing you see coming on the island off the Free Bridge, the county bridge, is a sign in the corner that has symbols of some of the organizations on the island. The Knights of Columbus, the Kiwanis Club, the Rotary Club, the Veterans of Foreign Wars, Groseal Nature and Land Conservancy, Groseal Garden Club, Tails, and Gyra. The majority of those are organizations that don't have a building. They have their meetings somewhere, but there's no building that you could go to saying, I'd like to join your organization. A sign, if it can be incorporated, can be a big boost to the different organizations that are on the island. You may get additional people interested in joining those organizations, and the things that they do can be advertised on the sign. Again, like Gary said, we're not selling anything to nonprofits, but the fact that we have nonprofit organizations with various activities, it would be nice to have an opportunity to put those onto the electronic board if possible. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you for your comments. Additional comments? Yes, ma'am. Come on up and give us your name and your address, please.
Schmayman, 8660 Voigt.
Hey, did you catch that, Lori? What was that again? Okay.
8660.
Yeah, your comments, please.
Okay, I don't want to sound like a broken record. You guys heard me in October. Yeah, so based on what these gentlemen have said, you know, there's such a need. We would be such a more rich community for having electronic signs to make us aware of all the programs going at the different churches, at the school. You know, it's all the nonprofit organization is what they're doing service-wise. And as far as, I appreciate what Brian had gone through, looking into the other ordinances. I have in front of me the City of Riverview ordinance, and it's a very strict ordinance. Like Brian said, they talk about lumens and how many times they can change. I don't know how they adhere to the ordinance. I guess, do they usually fine people when ordinances are not met?
It depends on the circumstances.
Okay. I would think if you put the ordinance out there and put strict regulations on it, people would try to adhere to them. You know, to just not do it because the possibility of people not adhering to the regulations, it's you know, there's so much to gain. You know, we're talking about a community that's going to be such a better community, and we're community, and we should, you know, think that way. You know, the people that drive in front of my church, they have no idea what goes on behind that church door. And there's just so much happening, and nobody knows about it. And I wish, you know, I don't have the answers for it. Maybe you can come up with something that can, as far as regulations or, you know, make it strict, make it, you know. I know the sign right outside off the island on Jefferson and Van Horn, it's just totally obnoxious. It's bright. That's not what we want. We want information. You know, I go to the Flat Rock Community Center, and at the corner of Jefferson and Gibraltar Road, they have their city sign, and it gives all the information. AARP is doing free tax service in Southgate, you know, for the elderly, and it's just such a welcoming sign that, you know, when I go by it, I just want to stay there and read it, which is not a good thing. But really would appreciate you guys looking into it. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you for your comment. Any other comments? Okay, let's bring it back to the table, and I guess I'll start with our subcommittee members. Jay?
I continue to struggle with this one as I have from the first time this came up. As has been mentioned, this is something I've heard about outside of this room, within my family, for decades, literally. So I understand the, you know, thinking about the signboard, you know, community signboard, is one that I have thought about for a long time. Certainly not electronic, but on the broader topic of the electronic signs, you know, I think this is a perfect example of something that, you know, this is the proverbial genie in the bottle. Once we allow these things, especially if we have to consider what that slippery slope brings, we have to be very careful when we open up that bottle and let the genie out, because it's going to, nearly impossible to say, okay, this didn't work, we're now going to prohibit them. Everybody who's put them up has to take them down. I mean, that's just not going to happen. So, we're really going to get one shot at getting this right if we do it. And I just, this is one where, people could be blaming us for years for allowing an eyesore. I do agree, especially with the nature of Macomb Street. I don't want to see, every business down the street, because, the benefit and the problem of these things is that the cost is going to continue to come down, and people will be able to build more elaborate signage cheaper. And so every business on Macomb Street ultimately will be able to afford this, and they'll be able to do lots of crazy things. Enforcement is something that we have to be concerned about. I think, as Ms. Schmemann indicated, enforcement is something we have to deal with, but it can deal with, but it's not something we can ignore. We have to make sure that whatever we do is enforceable in a reasonable way without putting a lot of burden on the township to enforce. I think ultimately those people who are aggrieved by it, the neighbors, would be the ones who would monitor it and say, that thing's turning every 20 minutes. It's supposed to be every half an hour. Come fix this. And, and frankly, if a neighbor is aggrieved by it, then I think we've done this wrong. And that's the important point. So, as I kind of play that out, I think we get to a place that probably works. When we get into the institutional, I think the question is, where does that stop? If churches are okay, are Knights of Columbus okay? If Knights of Columbus is okay, is VFW okay? If VFW is okay, are the music boosters okay? Et cetera, et cetera. Because I think you can draw corollary lines and string this out to where you get to groups that may or may not have been intended. And I'm thinking in this case not of the community signboard, which is enough of an issue because who qualifies for that, but speaking to the broader question of putting signs in various places around the island. And so, we need to be very careful on that and make sure that we're doing this in a reasonable way so that we get, if we do this, the right number of these things in the right locations with the right regulations on them. And so I was part of the conversation. I think Brian captured it correctly. I think you could tell there weren't a lot of clear decisions coming out of that because I think we're all struggling with it. I think there were a few. I think we were all kind of in agreement, not to speak for everybody, but I think Brian had captured this already, that Macomb Street and commercial, industrial was not something we wanted to see. I think we wanted no residential uses, but we do have the challenge then if if there's a rule no residential, the churches all are in residential communities of to varying degrees, and so it's all something we have to be very careful about as we go through this. So not a lot of answers in anything I'm saying, I admit that, but I'm just trying to express some of the things that I'm struggling with internally, and so we wanted to bring this out to the commission as a whole for further thoughts beyond the four of us who met.
Thank you, Jay. Jim?
Just to clarify, can I comment on the VFW letter?
Absolutely, please.
Okay.
Whatever you want to comment on.
Great. I was part of the subcommittee, and when we spoke, it was mainly as, Brian, great summary, Jay, great summary. We were mainly talking about the commercial aspect of Macomb and then the residential with the churches. And when I think of the churches, you're on East River Road, you're on Horse Mill, you're on Church, and these are all communities. They have neighbors right next to them. My biggest concern with the residential and with those churches, I mentioned, we're just about having lights on. And if that's the direction we want to go, then maybe we can manage that they have to be off at 8 o'clock at night or something. There's a way to do it, but I don't know if we want to go down that slippery slope. Macomb issue I always had was, and Brian, you mentioned at the beginning, the traditional look of Grosse-Ile, the small town look of Grosse-Ile. And can I foresee wanting signs blinking up and down Macomb? Probably not something I'd be that interested in. But then I read the VFW letter, which I thought was pretty interesting. It wasn't anything we had ever talked about in the subcommittee.
No.
We talked about Macomb Street. We talked about churches and residential areas. When I think of Four Corners, think that would be a great place to have signs that the churches could use, the VFW hall could use. It's one location. I would assume the majority of cars go that way. But then I remembered I was around for the debates of signs going there in the past, and I can't remember the reasoning. I do recall there being issues with, as mentioned, right? I mean, with the township, with Wayne County, but I can't tell you exactly what the issues were. I would like to further that discussion. Maybe times have changed. Maybe without the EEL camera around and other things that have changed over the last years, it might be worth going and asking that. But as far as the other, I just wasn't that excited about signs in residential areas or down Macomb Street. So.
Thank you, Jim.
Yep.
Mr. Ranka, sir, your thoughts?
Yeah, so I think, I'm kind of following Jay's thoughts here. If I look at this as two distinct groups, right? So one would be a community sign board that, is mentioned in the VFW letter. I think that's a pretty easy one to digest. Obviously, the township board would have to figure out, how it worked and everything else. But I would definitely be in favor of modifying the ordinance to at least allow that. I do have a lot of questions, and I don't have answers in my own mind right now for the residential areas, for the churches, for the Macomb Street, for the Grays Drive, which is really kind of part of Macomb Street. And then you get into the yacht clubs and the country clubs and everything else. So I don't know where I'm at on that. I think I'm leaning towards, probably that's not the right place for those types of messages. But, I don't know that I know enough on the subject right now to say absolutely not. But again, as Jay said and Jim said, I don't have the answer right now.
Okay. Thank you. Brian.
First, I'd say that I do understand the need for a community sign, and I want to thank the VFW for trying to find a creative solution that includes multiple agencies on the island. As a part of an organization myself, that we sometimes are trying to get out the word for specific events that are township related. I can understand where you guys are coming from, but that being said, I struggle with how do you have such a sign that is restricted, so that way you first do no harm with the type of project, but also make sure that it's effective and that it gets your message out rather than just spending money on a project itself. And so it goes to worrying about the light. Example on Grosseal, in most places we don't have any street lights at all. So having such a an e-sign on at night, I can't think of a single place on the island that, just on the top of my head, that would be a good location to see a sign like that. And again, I'm thinking worst case scenario, thinking of over here at Jefferson and Van Horn, or seeing a lot of the other signs that are out there that are pretty obnoxious, which I know you guys aren't specifically trying to move forward, but looking at the worst case scenarios. And then again, these types of signs are geared more for automobiles and motorists, and we're trying to create more of a walkable, bikeable community, small rural towns. So the types of signs out there, if they're made for automobiles, you have to have a quick change in order to be effective, and that gets into the fair play. If you have different organizations trying to put out these signs, if it's changing every half hour, every hour, or whatever is a longer duration, most people aren't going to have the same exposure. Some people are going to have prime time events where motorists are coming through with rush hours, and it opens up a lot of other issues related to other events. So I guess the last thing I would think about is how would you think about if you were to open it up to potential signs, what type of regulations could you put in place? And I think that whatever we do, that we'd want to make sure that it tries to make the e-message board basically the same thing as a regular sign. So, limiting the actual brightness of it. A comparison I'd think of is like of the traditional old Kindle, where it's like the e-ink and it basically looks like a piece of paper that's on the screen and it doesn't blind you at night. And that would be something that others have mentioned about turning off the signs at night, maybe at 6 o'clock or whatever, so that way the brightness issue at night wouldn't be an issue and it wouldn't take away from the character of the community. But again, goes back to, how do we enforce this, and is it something that we're prepared to do? So lots of questions, no answers, but I'm keeping an open mind and seeing how that we could come to something that gets at the need for multiple communities across multiple agencies across the community.
Thank you, Brian. Dan.
The type of signs, electronic signs that most people are familiar with, the bright, flashing, scrolling signs, I definitely find what, is not fitting for the character of the island. But for discussion purposes, I'd like to definitely bring up the concept of a static sign. Example, this would be a sign with a black background and white letters. It doesn't flash, doesn't change constantly. It's basically designed to resemble more of a traditional sign, while giving you the convenience to update it with your iPad or your iPhone at times. I think this could be done where it's just a basic sign, and it would definitely be a much larger discussion of where it would be appropriate for these type of signs, though. But I think a sign similar to what Brian was saying. I'm familiar with the older style Kindle also, where it was real basic lettering, and I think a lot of people, if they first glanced at it, they wouldn't think, oh, it's a big electronic sign. They would see it's a sign, So I think with careful consideration, I think we could accommodate electronic signs.
Thank you, Dan. Uta.
Thank you. I'm sensing a kind of consensus that is developing in our conversation. I want to take this in a slightly different direction. We talk about the electronics revolution and new signage and cheaper lighting sources and so forth. I happen to be fairly sensitive to light, and that sign on Van Horn, if I happen to be stuck there, it's just painful. So I know that while there may be ordinances in Trenton or in Riverview that regulate these intensities, I think they had a similar issue with a sign at the truck stop over on West Road at I-75. There was a time, and I think that was ultimately changed and brought down a notch. But I'm thinking about holiday lights. We just got through the holiday season, and this year there's like a whole new batch of lighting available, right? And some houses in some neighborhoods were just like Las Vegas. It was a little bit like showing up on the Vegas Strip. I've never been there, but I've seen it on TV, I'm pretty sure. We don't regulate that. And you see some neighbors look at it as art or as charming or fun, and other neighbors look at it as, oh my God, this is just over the top. And that's how I see these electronic message signs. They can be done tastefully to some people's standards. What is tasteful to some people is dull and useless to others. You're always going to have those conversations. But the technology is there, and people like moving forward with the technology. We have a web page, and we have Grosse Ile Connect to get messages to the community. They're both using technology in a way to try to get the message out, and they're not really hitting the mark. They're not getting the message out the way they should be. We have a corner that we would love to put a signboard on, and we keep running into obstacles that prevent that from happening. We've got a little bit of a perfect storm brewing here in that people want messages out. We're looking at a limited use of these electronic scrolling signs. That maybe the time has come to kind of move in a direction where we try it in one area of the island, and we see, is it possible to do something like that? If, I think, Eric, you had said we do a modified ordinance that allows this particular kind of a sign in a specific installation. You had brought out, Bob, about the the sign that's at Parkway where the road splits down to East River, where all the rounds are located. There was a lot of infighting over who got around on that sign because there was a limited amount of space. And in order for a sign to be effective, it had to be a certain size. So you only had so much room for so many signs, and people got left out, and that raised issues. So it's something, which messages get out. That's another thing that maybe not this commission, but someone would have to regulate what constitutes an appropriate message. What organization can send out what kind of a message? I think I'm going a little far afield here, but I just felt like I saw a little bit of momentum that we've got people saying we have a need. It needs to start here because the ordinance has to change here before anything can happen. And this is a meeting where there has just been a very effective exchange of ideas. So there may not be a decision today by any stretch, but I think a lot of people are really being thoughtful about it, and something I think positive will ultimately come out of this.
Thank you, Uda. Appreciate your comments.
Chairman, you can always do this too.
Oh, I will never do that to you. I don't do that to anybody. We welcome all comments for however long they take. This is a tough one, but just a couple of comments. First, the question of enforcement. If there's what drives enforcement on gross CO or complaints? Okay, if there's not a complaint, if a neighbor doesn't raise his hand and say this person or this area is out of sync with the ordinance, it won't happen. Nothing will happen. Someone has to go in and they have to say, I disagree with this, and sign their name, and then the zoning ordinance officer will investigate. That's the way things are done 98% of the time. So, we have to keep that in mind. I'm very leery of this whole thing, but I think there might be possibilities that I think we need to explore further. Absolutely, we need to get the attorney's legal opinion about whether we can or cannot segregate on the island. Because if we can actually segregate nonprofits, churches, literally, from boat clubs, golf clubs, daycare centers, whatever else, and be able to segregate that group, that changes the scope of the decision. Okay? If, on the other hand, the decision comes back and says you can't do that, okay, that drives us potentially in a different direction. So that is a very important thing for us to know. The second thing is the point, Brian's and Dan's point down there about the way signs are designed and configured, that perhaps better fit, more approach a static sign, so to speak, that has the electronic flexibility to be periodically changed. Okay, but doing it in such a fashion that perhaps there are things about the current signs that it's not in addition to, it's perhaps instead of, or with, as part of, but not, you have your standard sign out, and then the Kroger windows are all covered with electronic signs on the inside. Okay, thinking about it as to how to integrate it in with what we have. Now, I doubt that very few people would object if, for example, the gas station, the Shell station, which has the plastic, labels that say, $2.50 for a gallon of gas, would object, if all of a sudden that was $2.50 on an electronic sign. So, there are potential ways, to talk about this. The idea that, Dan had, I was having a similar thought about it, rather than, these wild lights and crazy figures and bouncing balls and all this other stuff to get your attention. None of that. okay? Black background or dark background and some white labels, some white letters of a specified size. I mean, things that bring it down from a potential monster like on the corner at the gas station of Jefferson and Van Horn to something that is in fact has some benefit without being so obnoxious. I mean, not allowing, for example, figures on there. Now, I don't want to see a sign that has a half a pizza on it. Okay, that does nothing for me. But if it's part of the pizza shop's sign over there to say, look, we have pizza today for 50 cents. Okay, I mean that's different. I mean, so I'm trying to see if there might be some way that we can kind of balance this. But again, it all comes back to where we start with. We have to have the legal underpinnings on this. It's not even so much a matter of fairness. It's what's legal and what's not. Okay, and we don't want to open the door and find out that all of a sudden now we create zoning board of appeals issues, and now the burden of what's right for a business or right for a church or whatever falls to them. We don't want to delegate that to them. We want something which is clear for the community. So, I guess what I would like to do is have our subcommittee work on this, kind of from that standpoint, and if what we come back with, if we can't come up with something, we'll come back with something. Now, we may not recommend it. We may think we've worked on this for 2 hours and this is what we came up with, but we think it's terrible. Well, that's for the Planning Commission to decide as a whole. You may like it and we don't like it. That could happen. So I'd like to work on this a little bit more, kind of in that context. But not until, first of all, you get the ruling from the attorney of the legalities of what we can and cannot do. And number two, I would like you to go back to those ordinances that, you pulled all these ordinances. Obviously don't get Trenton's, because Trenton's is terrible. Okay?
I was told that by an anonymous source.
Well, it shows. Now, that is a detriment to the community, and that would never be acceptable here. Okay? But go back and distill these things and break them down into various points. Size, shape, configuration, figures, background, symbols, potential frequency changes. Okay, and I got to believe we can go to other communities. For example, go out to Farmington Hills. Go on some of these high-end communities and find out what these guys are doing. I think there's a lot to be learned potentially from those folks. Maybe even more so than what we have downriver. I don't know. And put this together in a logical flow, so that when we get together and talk about it, we can kind of step through the various elements and see what we come up with at the end. That's okay with you, Jay?
That makes perfect sense.
How about you, Jim? Sounds good. Brian, is that something you can do for us?
I'm getting my notes caught up real quick. I think I got you.
Okay. And I want to make sure, and I'm serious about going to these upper end communities. And I'm sure you've got contacts. You can find ways.
I know a couple people.
I'm sure you do. Okay. And so maybe, Brian, sometime in maybe February.
Yeah, I'd like
late
to.
February or March or early March, something like that. Let's get together and talk about this again. I want to have all the information in front of us at the time.
I'd like to do our best to keep the momentum going. So the three of us can kind of talk separately, but I'd say let's shoot for February. Potentially my regular day down here, just for efficiency's sake.
All right. Now, let's be clear what we're not talking about. We are not talking about a sign at Four Corners. We are not talking about a sign at the Grocio Bridge. That is out of scope for us. That is not our decision. All we're worried about is the ordinance. Anything else that happens beyond that is up to the Township Board. Clear?
If I might.
Yeah.
I think what we were saying is that in order for the board to consider this, we would need to enable
Correct.
the signage.
Exactly. So
Within
we're
that
talking about it from a
jurisdiction.
community perspective.
Yes.
We're not talking about it about trying to meet a need for one at Four Corners.
But some of
We're
that
dealing with
yeah.
the broad scope of the island.
Right, but as we're talking about it, part of that is locations, location restrictions. So we would talk about whether that's a potential allowed location. Is that
I don't know that
fair
we
to
could
say?
do that because that would be spot zoning. I don't know.
Could we say on township property and let the township decide where the township would put it?
Well, Brian, that's something for you to consider. I intuitively don't think so, but then again, I don't. No, put it down.
Worth asking the question.
That's obviously one of the questions.
He can tell us.
Okay. All right. Yes, Huda.
I just wanted to add, because Jay did bring it up there, Four Corners and the bridge are two options, but the township also owns other properties where potentially, like on Macomb Street, we have a parking lot, we have where they exhibited the Christmas trees for the businesses this past season. There are opportunities there, maybe for a different approach, like a kiosk, or like they do in Glen Arbor. They have a building where posters get posted on a central piece of property, but that might be, and I don't know if that becomes spot zoning if you allow an electronic message board specifically on township-owned property or for a municipal purpose. I don't know how that would go over, but I guess just bear in mind that those might be things that people will raise. Because if I come up with it, I'm sure other people have before me. So
It's a perfectly valid question, and I think it'll be a good place to help get an answer to that question first, so we move forward. We don't go to step 2 before we know the answer to step 1, if that makes sense.
Okay. Any additional comments from the table?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, can I ask one more
sir,
question?
please.
So I'd like to see an example of some of these things, right? Because obviously my mind was first on the paradigm of where Uta's was with, Las Vegas style flashing, corner of Van Horn and Jefferson. But then Dan and Brian brought up, kind of the Kindle style sign, and I'm sure there's plenty of examples of, more of a tasteful, non-obtrusive, not going to throw out, massive amounts of light. It'd be nice to see some examples as well when we come back.
Which part?
can we regulate style?
Absolutely.
Well, yeah, it depends on exactly what you mean by style, but yeah, I'll go out on a limb and say.
And while you're talking with those northern communities, ask them about enforcement.
It's already, it's something I've encountered in my other client communities. That's why that's why we brought it up as part of the subcommittee conversation is, it's one thing to have, you set these in place and you say it can't change more than, once an hour, 4 times an hour, whatever the threshold is that you set on the frequency, but you literally cannot have somebody posted outside there to monitor that. So it becomes a real question at that point of, are people going to follow the rules or not? I wasn't trying to go down the path that was mentioned earlier. We shouldn't not do it because there's a potential concern over enforcement. That's not really a legit reason to not do something, but we need to find a way to make sure that that people are held to the standards of the ordinance, just like we would with anything else, quite frankly.
It's called protecting the community.
Sure. There's a reason. If there's a reason to put it in the ordinance to begin with, then there's a reason to uphold it and enforce it. It just, like I said, it becomes difficult with after hours and weekend usage of those signs. Enforcement just isn't here at that time.
Very good, Brian. Any other comments from the table? Is everybody comfortable with the approach? Yeah, I see heads nodding. Any other comments from anybody? Yes, sir.
like to make a comment relative to this visitation to upscale communities. I'll just remind you that probably every upscale community you're going to go to is going to have a newspaper. Thank you.
We'll keep that in mind. Okay, no other comments? Then we'll move on to the next item, which is the famous chairs report. Brian has some updates for us. Brian, would you, we have the Bayview study.
We'll go ahead and start with Bayview. That was another item that was presented and discussed at the October meeting. We did include that as our subcommittee meeting as part of the conversation. I'm in the process of preparing some draft language, which we can either bring back to the subcommittee, since we're going to meet again anyway, or we can prepare it for review with the next full commission. Given the timing of it, I might suggest that we go back to subcommittee first. That way I can get your comments before we bring it back to the full commission.
Yes.
So the full commission knows really what we're doing is we've identified the pros and cons as I kind of showed you all those tables at the last presentation. Sorry, Uta. I'll show it to you at another time. The pros and the cons of directly applying the R1F standards to our study area, which is the waterfront side of Bayview, and with a few tweaks here and there, it's a pretty good fit. So what I'm doing is basically just preparing what some draft language would look like to address the discrepancies between those two particular neighborhoods, which we kind of whittled down to maybe 2 or 3 different aspects where we would need to make some change. So I fully expect to have it's almost done. It wasn't ready for presentation tonight, but I do have a draft going, and certainly will be ready by the next time subcommittee meets.
Okay, let's plan on that.
You got
progress. Okay, current projects.
So my notes are all blending now. I apologize. Okay, I have two items. So one, we for the majority of our group, those that were here, Uta being the exception, our pre-app meeting for the project on Macomb Street, which may have been the October meeting. I don't know. It seems like a long time ago at this point. It might have been prior to that. Regardless, we did receive a revised site plan on that particular project. I am finalizing my written comments to get back to the owner and his project architect. At this point, I've kind of got to finish that off to decide whether it's really ready for subcommittee review or not. I think it probably warrants another round of revisions, which is why I want to get my comments back first. But if there's a way to get that one ready, we'll tag that one on too in terms of a subcommittee meeting in February.
Okay, I want to make sure that when you've done your work, okay, that we have a concept review meeting with that applicant, with the 3 officers, before that comes back.
Yep.
We don't want to come back with 20 items again.
Agreed, and I think he understood that as well. So that is the plan, and that's the direction the applicant.
No agenda for that until you've reviewed it, made your comments. They've said this is what we want to do.
Yep.
Concept review committee will review it.
Yeah, and obviously we're going to, because of the nature of the discussion and some of the concerns that were noted during the public portion of that meeting, we're going to make sure that we have input and involvement from the fire department as well. If you remember, we had an issue with that narrow driveway that we want to make sure moving forward that we're all on the same page before it comes back to the full commission.
I don't know if you know, but the concept review committee is the secretary, vice chair, and the chair.
Yeah, my apologies. I was thinking the subcommittee, but actually that will be a different group anyway. So.
Yes, that's under the site plan ordinance.
You and Jay will be stuck on that one too with me. So Jim gets a pass. Okay. Jim gets a pass. And then the last item I had was just a real brief update. To be honest, I don't have a lot of information, but I was informed today the building official has been working with the property owner. You may recall the office building on Macomb Street that had its siding
Trust me, I recall
removed, for lack of a better way to phrase it. The building official has been working with that owner. Community Development did receive an email within the last week from that owner indicating that he expects to be in for plans and permits for review by the building official shortly. The expectation is they want to be ready for whenever the weather will cooperate to allow them then to at least reface the building and get a proper material up on the front and sides where currently none exists right now, quite frankly.
That will be good to see.
So there is progress being made, albeit it may not be as rapidly as some of us would have liked, but at least want you to know that there is progress being made.
Okay.
I think that's all I have, Mr. Chair, unless I'm missing something you wanted me to hit.
No, I think you've covered it. Okay, let's talk about the next meeting date. I did not bring my calendar, unfortunately. Okay, so we're talking conceptually with the subcommittee work and the concept review committee meeting. A February meeting is probably not particularly practical. I would say we're moving into early March, perhaps. Brian?
First Monday's the 6th, third Monday's the 20th.
How about we try for the 6th? How does that look for people? And if for some reason, we're not ready to have a productive meeting, the fallback would be 2 weeks later. Does that fit for everybody? So plan on March 6th. And Lori will communicate when we get closer. Okay? Anybody have anything else? Now, entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Motion, support, all aye, meeting adjourned. Thank you very much.